There's something sacred about the ordinary moments, the quiet rituals that seem small but somehow shape who we are. I remember that day in my kitchen when my daughter stood there, confidently giving me instructions about how I should be cooking, what ingredients I should use, and even how I should arrange my pantry. At first I laughed, that kind of laugh that sits between amusement and disbelief, because for a second I forgot that she's no longer a little girl tugging at my sleeve asking for help. She's growing, becoming her own person, finding her voice. But it wasn't until she opened that freezer and paused, looking at something that carried more meaning than either of us expected, that I realized how profound those simple, everyday exchanges can be. Wisdom, I've learned, rarely arrives with fanfare. It doesn't always come in speeches, books, or grand experiences. Sometimes it shows up quietly, tucked inside the most ordinary corners of life, like the sound of a child's laughter, the smell of an old family recipe, or the warmth of sunlight through the kitchen window. It's easy to miss if we're rushing, if we're too focused on being right or being in control. But those small moments are where the lessons of life breathe and grow. When I think about this, I'm reminded of Eleanor Roosevelt. She wasn't born into a life of confidence or ease. She often felt invisible, even unwanted as a child. But she didn't wait for greatness to find her, she built it through small, quiet acts of courage. Every day she listened. She read. She reached out to people in pain, people society had forgotten. She didn't look for wisdom in grandeur. She found it in the lives of ordinary men and women who taught her resilience, compassion, and grace. That's the power of seeing meaning in the everyday. Because when you learn to listen, truly listen, to life, you begin to see how every experience, even the smallest one, is a teacher. When my daughter looked at that container of ice cream, the same recipe my mother used to make, she didn't realize she was touching history. She didn't know how many times those hands, my mother's hands, had stirred the same ingredients, perhaps humming the same tune I now hum. In that frozen memory, generations met the past, the present, and the promise of tomorrow. And I thought maybe this is what life has been trying to teach us all along. That the wisdom we seek in books, in success, in the rush of progress, it's already here, in the rhythms of our own lives. Our ancestors understood this better than we do. They lived in tune with time, patient and observant. They paid attention to nature, to patterns, to the silence between things. They knew that the world whispers lessons long before it shouts them. It's why they cherished family dinners, why they told stories by firelight, why they paused before speaking. They knew wisdom doesn't come from speed, but from stillness. In a world that celebrates noise and speed, that stillness has become rare, but it's still there, waiting for us to return to it. There's a reason the great teachers of history, from Socrates to Frederick Douglass to Maya Angelou, carried an inner calm even amid chaos. They knew that wisdom is not just knowledge, it's perspective. It's seeing beyond what is happening and understanding why it's happening. And that kind of perspective can only be born in quiet reflection. It can only come when we slow down enough to notice the lessons hidden in our ordinary days. So when I stood there that afternoon with my daughter and that old container in her hands, I felt time itself teaching me something, that the real education of life doesn't happen in moments of control, but in moments of connection. It's not about showing the next generation that we know more, it's about showing them that we are still learning, still growing, still listening to life just as they are. Because that's how wisdom flows, not from parent to child or teacher to student, but from one heart to another, in humility and love. And if there's one thing I want my daughter to carry from that day, it's this, that life will never stop teaching her, as long as she keeps paying attention. Every smile, every mistake, every silence, it's all part of the curriculum. So tonight, as we sit around our tables, as we scroll through our days, as we hurry to the next thing, I hope we pause for just a moment. I hope we look around and see the hidden beauty in what seems ordinary. Because those quiet moments, those simple human connections, are where the timeless voices of history still speak. They whisper not to our minds but to our souls, reminding us that wisdom is not found in the noise of the world, but in the heartbeat of everyday life. There's a moment every parent faces, the quiet realization that your child no longer sees you as the all-knowing, all-powerful figure you once seemed to be. It's both humbling and beautiful. One day your words are gospel, and the next they're met with an eye roll or a sigh. When my daughter began asserting herself in my own home, confident, outspoken, sure of her choices, it stirred something in me. At first I felt the sting of pride, the instinct to remind her who raised her, who taught her how to be strong. But as I watched her move through the kitchen, making her own decisions, I began to see something else, a reflection of all the lessons I'd once tried to teach her, now alive in her voice. And I thought, maybe this is what growth looks like, a little uncomfortable, a little loud but deeply necessary. Growth has never been a gentle process. History shows us that every generation is shaped by a tension between what was and what's becoming. When I think of that, I often remember Abigail Adams, a woman whose strength and intellect helped define a nation's conscience before women even had a seat at the table. She once wrote to her husband, John Adams, urging him to remember the ladies, as he and his colleagues drafted the laws of a young America. She wasn't loud or defiant in the way history sometimes portrays rebellion. She was thoughtful, deliberate, and deeply rooted in her belief that progress starts within the home, in the lessons we pass down, in the courage we nurture, and in the example we set for our children. When I look at my daughter, I see that same quiet revolution unfolding in modern form. The confidence that once made her challenge me is the same confidence that will one day allow her to lead, to make her voice heard in a world that can so easily drown it out. That's the paradox of parenting, isn't it? We spend years teaching them to stand on their own 2 feet, and when they finally do, we ache a little inside, not because they're wrong, but because we realize they no longer need us in the same way. Yet, that's exactly the point. Our purpose as parents isn't to be needed forever, it's to prepare them to thrive without us. I think about Mary McLeod Bethune, who founded a college with nothing but faith, $5, and a vision. She raised leaders out of generations who had once been silenced. She understood something profound, that education isn't just about information, it's about transformation. It's about lighting a fire that continues long after your own hands are gone. When she taught young women and men to believe in their potential, she knew that some of them would one day challenge her ways, her thinking, her traditions. And she welcomed it, because she knew growth demands renewal. She knew the next generation must always stretch beyond the last one. There's something sacred about that exchange between those who have walked the road before and those just beginning their journey. It's like the passing of a torch, one that can't be forced or held onto too tightly. When my daughter raised her voice in my kitchen, I realized she wasn't trying to diminish mine, she was practicing using hers. She was discovering who she was in the safety of my presence, testing the sound of her own authority, just as I once did in front of my mother. That's the cycle of growth, one generation speaking so that the next can learn to speak even louder. But as much as this is about empowerment, it's also about grace. Because it takes grace to let go. Grace to see your reflection in someone else's defiance. Grace to recognize that love sometimes means stepping aside, trusting that the lessons you've given, your words, your example, your values, are enough to guide them forward. History has shown us time and again that the strongest leaders, the wisest hearts, are those who know when to step back and allow others to shine. Nelson Mandela once said that true leaders lead from behind, allowing others to feel like they're in front. He understood that leadership isn't about power, it's about service. It's about creating space for others to rise. That's what I see now when I think about that day, not defiance, not disrespect, but the sacred unfolding of independence. It's the same strength I wanted her to have when I read her stories about Rosa Parks, when I told her about Eleanor Roosevelt's quiet persistence, when I reminded her of my grandmother's faith through hardship. All of those stories, all of that resilience were never meant to stay with me. They were meant to live through her, reshaped, reimagined, renewed. So when she raised her voice in my house, I smiled, because that voice, confident, unafraid, and unapologetically her own, was proof that the seeds I had planted were growing. Not perfectly, not always gently, but faithfully. And maybe that's the message life gives us as we grow older, that love is not control, it's release. It's watching your reflection evolve and trusting that it will carry your wisdom, even when it walks its own path. Because in the end, that's what legacy truly is. It's not about keeping things the same, it's about giving the next generation the courage to grow differently, to be more, to rise higher. That's what time teaches us, and that's what our children remind us. And when we listen closely, beyond the noise, beyond the pride, we can hear the timeless rhythm of generations speaking to each other. The same rhythm that connects mother to daughter, teacher to student, leader to nation. The rhythm that whispers through history, we are here because someone believed we could be more. There's a lesson life gives us again and again, that humility is not weakness, it's wisdom. It's the quiet understanding that we don't always have to be right, that strength often means stepping back and listening rather than pushing forward and insisting. I learned that in my own kitchen one afternoon when I found myself face to face with my daughter's growing independence. She stood there, confident and sure, ready to tell me how things should be done. My instinct was to correct her, to remind her of all the years of experience and hardened wisdom I carried. But then I paused. I remembered how once upon a time I stood in that same place, young, passionate, convinced that I knew what was best. And in that pause I realized something deeper. Life had brought me full circle. Humility is that bridge between what we know and what we're still learning. It's what allows love to stay soft, even when the ego wants to be hard. And I thought about how many times history has shown us this very truth. Take Abraham Lincoln, for example. He was a man of great conviction, but even greater humility. He filled his cabinet not with those who agreed with him, but with those who challenged him, people who had once opposed him. Because he knew leadership isn't about surrounding yourself with echoes of your own voice. It's about creating space for truth, even when that truth feels uncomfortable. That lesson is as relevant in our families as it is in our history books. Every relationship between parents and children, between partners, between friends, thrives not because someone wins every argument, but because someone chooses grace. There's power in saying, maybe I don't see it your way, but I'm willing to understand. That's not surrender, that's wisdom. It's the same kind of quiet strength that shaped the lives of those who came before us, the ones who built bridges where others built walls. When I think about humility, I think of Martin Luther King Jr., not just the man who gave speeches that moved a nation, but the man who knelt to pray, who washed away bitterness with faith. His power came not from pride, but from purpose. He understood that when you lead with humility, you don't lose authority, you gain connection. And connection is what transforms hearts. In the same way, when we as parents or mentors lead with humility, we show our children that authority is not about dominance. It's about guidance, empathy, and love. That's what I felt that day with my daughter, a small tug between pride and peace, and in choosing peace I saw her eyes soften. The tone of our conversation shifted, not because I gave up my place as her mother, but because I invited her into it. I showed her that strength can be kind, and that listening is a form of leadership. And that's something we all need reminding of in our homes, in our workplaces, in our communities. You see, history moves forward when humility leads the way. Think of George Washington at the end of the Revolutionary War. After victory, he had the chance to become something close to a king, but he refused. He laid down his power and returned to private life, setting a precedent that defined the moral compass of a young nation. That decision, quiet, humble, deeply human, taught the world that real greatness doesn't need to cling to control. It simply knows when to let go. We live in a time where everyone wants to be heard, to be right, to have the last word. But wisdom isn't about shouting louder, it's about listening deeper. It's about knowing that truth has many voices, and sometimes the quietest one carries the most meaning. As mothers, fathers, leaders, and friends, we must be willing to step aside from our certainty long enough to let love speak. Because love, the kind that truly transforms, is born in humility. That's what history whispers to us through every story of grace, every act of restraint, every moment of compassion that changed the course of humanity. The greatest movements weren't built on arrogance, they were built on understanding. The greatest families aren't held together by control, they're held together by forgiveness. And the greatest hearts aren't the loudest, they're the ones that listen first. So when I think back to that day, standing in my kitchen, watching my daughter challenge my way of doing things, I smile. Because in that moment, both of us were learning. She was learning how to speak her truth, and I was learning once again how to listen with grace. And maybe that's what this life is, a constant exchange between teaching and learning, leading and following, speaking and listening. We are each other's teachers in ways we don't even realize. Every generation humbles the one before it, and in that humility, wisdom is born again. So as you move through your own life, through your homes, your relationships, your communities, remember this. You don't lose yourself by being humble, you deepen yourself. You make space for love, for growth, for the next beautiful voice to rise. Because humility, more than anything else, is what keeps wisdom alive through the ages. There comes a moment in every life when we're called to rise, not because it's easy, not because the timing feels perfect, but because something inside us whispers, it's your turn. That whisper can be small, almost fragile at first, but it's persistent. It comes in moments when no one's watching, when the house is quiet, when doubt feels heavy, when we're staring at the choices before us wondering if we're really capable of more. That moment came to me one morning as I was reflecting on my daughter, that same daughter who once stood in my kitchen, trying to teach me something about myself. I watched her step into her own strength, her own opinions, her own dreams. And I realized the very thing I had spent years trying to give her, courage, was now being reflected back to me. It reminded me that growth doesn't stop with age. It doesn't pause when life feels comfortable. Courage is not a chapter we finish. It's a story we keep rewriting every single day. History has always shown us what it means to rise when the world expects you to stay quiet. Think about Rosa Parks. She wasn't a famous leader when she sat down on that bus in Montgomery. She was a seamstress, tired after a long day's work. Yet in that one moment she said no, not with anger, not with violence, but with unshakable dignity. That quiet act of defiance became a thunderclap heard across the world, because courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to move. And that's a lesson for all of us, that courage isn't reserved for the battlefield or the stage. It lives in the choices we make each day, in the way we show up for our families, in how we stand by our values when no one's clapping. It lives in parents who work 2 jobs but still come home with love to give, in teachers who refuse to give up on a struggling student, in every soul who keeps believing even when the world tells them they shouldn't. There's something deeply American about that spirit, that unyielding hope that says, I may fall but I'll rise again. Our ancestors carried it across oceans and through storms. Our forebears held it through war, through injustice, through loss. It's that same spirit that built cities from dust, that marched on Washington, that reached for the stars. And it's the same spirit that sits quietly in each of us, waiting for the moment when we'll listen, when we'll rise to meet what life is asking of us. But courage, like love, is not inherited, it's practiced. It must be chosen again and again. Every time we decide to forgive instead of resent, to speak truth instead of stay silent, to keep going instead of giving up, we strengthen it. And sometimes courage means standing tall. Other times it means kneeling in humility, knowing that faith will carry what we cannot. I think about Eleanor Roosevelt, who once said, "You must do the thing you think you cannot do." And she lived those words not as someone who sought attention, but as someone who believed in action. She spoke for those who had no voice. She pushed her own fears aside because she understood that the world changes when ordinary people dare to be brave. And her courage continues to echo through generations, reminding us that leadership begins in the quiet decision to stand for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. We need that reminder today in our homes, our schools, our communities. We need to remember that courage isn't about being unafraid, it's about being willing. Willing to show up when you don't have all the answers. Willing to love in a world that sometimes feels divided. Willing to believe in your own worth, even when life tries to make you forget it. When I think of courage, I think of every woman and man who has stood at a crossroads, unsure, afraid, and yet still choosing to take the next step. That's how history moves forward, one small act of bravery at a time. It's how Harriet Tubman led her people to freedom, not with grand speeches but with relentless faith. It's how countless unsung heroes have lifted our nation higher, even when their names were never remembered. And in our own lives we are called to that same spirit, maybe not to lead a movement but to lead a life that matters, to be brave enough to raise kind children in a harsh world, to forgive those who have hurt us, to keep dreaming after failure, because courage, my friends, isn't about changing the world in one stroke, it's about changing ourselves in one choice. So when my daughter stood there, confident and unshaken, I saw something beautiful, the continuation of courage, the passing of a flame. She reminded me that every generation must discover its own strength, its own voice. And as parents, as leaders, as dreamers, our job isn't to control that flame but to keep it burning. And maybe that's what this journey is really about, not living without fear, but learning to move with faith. Knowing that our ancestors stood where we stand now, uncertain, imperfect, but willing. Knowing that every act of courage, no matter how small, becomes part of something eternal. Because courage, like love and wisdom, never dies. It echoes through our homes, our communities, through time itself. It becomes the heartbeat of progress, the rhythm of humanity's growth, the song that every brave soul adds a verse to. And that, my friends, is what keeps the spirit of timeless voices alive, the unbroken chain of courage that connects who we were, who we are, and who we're still becoming. There's a quiet kind of wisdom that comes from struggle, the kind that doesn't shout or boast, but whispers in our hearts when we're still enough to listen. It's the wisdom of experience, of pain turned into perspective, of failure turned into faith. And in so many ways, that's the wisdom our ancestors carried with them, through storms, through injustice, through times when hope felt like a fragile flame barely staying lit. I think often about how history teaches us that wisdom doesn't come from perfection, it comes from endurance. It comes from learning how to walk forward even when the road isn't clear. Think of Frederick Douglass, who once said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." He understood that wisdom isn't found in comfort, it's found in the lessons that hardship carves into our souls. It's in those nights when we question our strength, those moments when we're forced to dig deeper than we ever thought possible. And yet, wisdom is not only found in the great speeches or the grand moments of history. It lives in the quiet resilience of everyday people. The grandmother who raised generations on faith and prayer. The mother who worked long hours but still managed to give her children a sense of worth. The father who went without so his family could have more. These are the unsung teachers of wisdom, the ones who turned sacrifice into strength, and who showed us that true intelligence is not just knowing facts, but knowing what matters. Sometimes I think we forget that wisdom is not a possession, it's a process. It doesn't arrive all at once. It builds over time, layer by layer, experience by experience. Like the way an old oak tree grows, roots deepening underground, unseen but steady, while its branches reach upward toward the light. That's what wisdom does to us. It grounds us, even as it teaches us to reach higher. There's something profoundly human about that journey. We are all in our own ways students of life. And life, as every elder has told us, is the toughest, most honest teacher we'll ever have. It doesn't give easy tests. It doesn't hand out answers. It gives lessons disguised as loss, setbacks that reveal our resilience, failures that uncover who we truly are. I remember hearing a story about Abraham Lincoln, not the polished figure of the history books, but the man behind the title. The one who failed in business, lost elections, buried children, and yet never let defeat define him. Lincoln's wisdom wasn't born in his victories, it was born in his perseverance. It was born in his belief that even in division there could be unity, even in pain there could be purpose. That kind of wisdom is what this world still needs. Not just the kind that comes from knowledge, but the kind that comes from compassion. The kind that listens before it speaks, that seeks to understand before it judges. Wisdom that doesn't demand to be right, but strives to do right. And in our own lives, wisdom asks us to slow down, to look inward, to stop rushing from one goal to the next and instead ask ourselves, what am I really learning? Because sometimes the lesson isn't in getting what we want, it's in realizing we can survive what we feared. It's in discovering that strength isn't about never breaking, it's about learning how to rebuild. Our history is full of people who modeled that truth. Think of Maya Angelou, who turned her pain into poetry, her silence into song. Or Martin Luther King Jr., who carried wisdom beyond his years, the understanding that love, not hate, was the truest form of power. Or the countless unnamed heroes who guided others through dark times with nothing but faith in their hearts and wisdom in their words. Wisdom, I believe, is the bridge between generations. It's how we pass meaning through time. It's how we ensure that our struggles were not in vain, that every trial we've endured becomes a lesson for those who come after us. And when I look at my own daughter, standing in that same kitchen where I once stood, I realize that my role is not to shield her from life's challenges, but to help her gather wisdom from them. To remind her that her mistakes are not signs of failure, but steps toward understanding. Because the truth is, we all have freezers full of frozen moments, memories, or emotions we haven't yet unpacked. But inside those moments lies the wisdom we've been searching for. The wisdom that says, you made it through, you learned, you grew. That's what makes us timeless, not our success, but our evolution. Our ability to rise, reflect, and pass forward the lessons that shaped us. And so, as we carry these lessons forward, as we listen to the echoes of history and the quiet voices of our own hearts, let us remember this. Wisdom is not something we find at the end of the journey. It's something we gather along the way. It's the story of our becoming. And that story, imperfect, resilient, and beautifully human, is what makes us part of the unending song that is timeless voices. There are moments in life when love humbles us, when it reminds us that being right is never more important than being kind. That truth often reveals itself in the small, ordinary moments, in the way we speak to one another at the dinner table, in how we listen when we'd rather argue, or in the patience we show when our pride wants to lead the way. I've learned again and again that real love is not about control, it's about compassion. It's not about winning, it's about understanding. When I think about the role of love and compassion in human growth, my mind often turns to the story of Eleanor Roosevelt, a woman who knew what it meant to stand quietly in strength. She lived through heartbreak, public scrutiny, and deep personal loss, yet she chose to keep her heart open. Eleanor used her pain to build bridges rather than walls. She said, "You must do the thing you think you cannot do." And she did just that. She showed an entire generation that compassion is not weakness, but one of the highest forms of courage. Love, in its truest form, teaches us how to see people, not for what they have or how they behave, but for who they are beneath it all. It's what allows a mother to forgive a child, a friend to extend grace after betrayal, or a community to come together after division. It's what transforms a frozen heart into something capable of healing, But make no mistake, compassion takes work. It asks us to quiet the noise of our egos and listen with empathy. It asks us to look beyond the immediate and see the humanity that binds us all. I've seen this kind of compassion transform homes, schools, and even nations. During some of the darkest times in American history, the civil rights movement, for example, it wasn't anger that sustained the leaders. It was love. It was the belief that justice without compassion is incomplete. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend." And that message was not just poetic, it was revolutionary. It reminded us that progress built on bitterness will never last. Only progress rooted in love endures. In our personal lives, too, compassion calls us to evolve. There are moments when we realize that people who hurt us were also hurting themselves. There are moments when forgiveness feels impossible, but somehow, through grace, it becomes a gift we give ourselves. And sometimes compassion shows up in unexpected ways, in a quiet gesture, a shared meal, or even, yes, in the humbling sight of a daughter opening a freezer and finding something she didn't expect. A reminder of love stored away, waiting to be remembered. Love, you see, is never wasted. Even when it seems ignored or unreturned, it leaves an imprint. It teaches us patience, humility, and the courage to stay open when closing off would be easier. It reminds us that the real measure of a life well lived is not how much we have, but how much we give, not what we achieve, but how we care. And that's something history teaches over and over again. Think of the nurses during wartime who tended to soldiers on both sides of the line. Think of the families who risked their lives to protect others during the Holocaust. Think of the millions of quiet heroes who have chosen kindness over cruelty. They remind us that compassion doesn't make the world softer, it makes it stronger. It doesn't erase pain, but it redeems it. Each generation inherits not only the progress of those before, but also the love they left behind. Our task, yours, mine, our children's, is to keep that love alive, to model empathy in a world that too often celebrates indifference, to be the kind of people who choose understanding over judgment, dialogue over division, and healing over harm. Because when we lead with compassion, we become part of something eternal. We add our voice to a legacy that transcends time. We remind the world and ourselves that love is not a luxury, it's a responsibility. It's the quiet force that has held families, communities, and entire civilizations together when everything else was falling apart. And so, when I look at that moment, the one that began with frustration and ended in revelation, I see more than a simple family story. I see a reflection of humanity itself, imperfect, messy, but deeply capable of grace. I see how love, even when buried beneath pride or misunderstanding, has a way of thawing. That's what compassion does. It turns tension into teaching, pain into peace, distance into connection. It transforms not just others but ourselves. And in doing so, it reminds us that every act of love, no matter how small, carries forward the voice of something far greater than any one of us. Because when love speaks through us, when compassion becomes our language, we become part of a legacy that will never fade. A legacy of empathy, courage, and unity. A legacy that lives on through timeless voices. There are moments when silence speaks louder than words, when life asks us not to react but to reflect. Sometimes the most powerful lessons are not found in what we say, but in what we choose to hold with grace. As I've grown older, I've learned that wisdom often arrives quietly, wrapped not in victory but in stillness. It comes when you've walked through enough storms to know that peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the mastery of self. We live in a world that celebrates noise, fast reactions, quick judgments, constant motion. But history teaches us that true change, the kind that lasts, is born from patience and perspective. Think of Nelson Mandela sitting in a prison cell for 27 years. He could have filled that silence with bitterness. He could have used every waking moment to plan revenge, but instead he allowed time to refine him. He chose reflection over rage. He emerged not as a broken man, but as a leader with the wisdom to forgive, to unite, to heal a nation that had forgotten what humanity looked like. That kind of strength, the quiet, grounded kind, doesn't come from pride. It comes from humility. It comes from knowing that our worth isn't determined by who shouts the loudest, but by who listens the deepest. And in those moments when life feels unfair, when someone hurts you or misunderstands you, that's when grace becomes your greatest teacher. It's easy to demand respect. It's harder to earn it through restraint. I remember reading about Abraham Lincoln, a man who faced constant criticism, even from those he tried to help. When his advisors urged him to retaliate against his political enemies, Lincoln said, Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends? He knew that leadership wasn't about proving superiority, it was about elevating humanity. He carried the burden of a divided nation with patience, and when the time came to speak, his words, shaped by silence and reflection, helped heal a country on the brink of destruction. In our homes, in our workplaces, in our hearts, we too are asked to practice that same grace. Maybe it's when your child tests your patience, when your spouse disappoints you, when life throws a curveball that makes you question your strength. In those moments, the easy thing is to lash out. The harder but far more powerful thing is to pause, to breathe, to remind yourself that reacting in anger may satisfy your pride, but responding with grace strengthens your spirit. Because every time we choose peace over pride, we are shaping the kind of legacy we'll leave behind. The next generation is watching us, our children, our students, our communities. They're learning not from what we preach, but from how we carry ourselves. Are we teaching them to fight fire with fire, or are we showing them how to rise above the flames with dignity? History honors those who led with heart. From Rosa Parks, who sat quietly yet powerfully in defiance, to Mahatma Gandhi, who showed that stillness can shake empires. Their strength wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It simply was. It radiated from conviction, the kind that comes when your soul is at peace with your purpose. There's something deeply human about learning to let go of control, to trust that life, in all its mystery, has its own rhythm. When we stop trying to force every outcome, we begin to see the beauty in the unfolding. We find that our most profound moments of growth come not from pushing harder, but from softening. Not from speaking more, but from listening. And perhaps that's the lesson behind so many of life's humbling moments, even the ones that begin with frustration or misunderstanding. Sometimes, when a loved one challenges you, when emotions rise, it's life's way of asking, can you love beyond your pride? Can you choose peace even when it's hard? That's where wisdom lives, in those quiet, steady choices. In the moments you could have reacted but didn't, in the grace you extend when no one is watching. That is the foundation of real strength. Because at the end of the day, it's not how loud your voice was that people remember, it's how your presence made them feel. It's the peace you carried, the kindness you shared, the patience you modeled. Those things outlive noise. They become part of something timeless, something that echoes through generations. So when you find yourself in the middle of life's chaos, when the world seems loud, unfair, or overwhelming, take a breath. Remember that silence can be sacred, reflection can be revolutionary, and grace, above all, can turn even the hardest moments into healing. Because every time we choose understanding over ego, every time we choose peace over power, we add to the chorus of humanity's better angels. The ones who whisper wisdom through time, reminding us of who we truly are. And that whisper, calm, steady, full of grace, is the voice that endures, the voice that inspires, the voice that will forever live on through timeless voices.